G'day, Professor Joseph Drew here. I'm here to talk to you this time about the problem of revitalising rural areas. This is a particular problem in Australia. It's holding back our national economy and it's disadvantaging Australians that don't live in the capital cities, but it's also a very big problem in the US and in Japan. Rural areas are dying. Why are they dying? This video will explain why it happens and what the solutions are, which are relatively straightforward if we had good political will. So, first of all, is a fair grant system. We need a system of intergovernmental grants because some areas in every country are going to be richer or poorer than other areas due to natural endowments, due to waves of immigration, due to paths of industrialization. Now, if we want to be one country, particularly a country where we pride ourselves on everyone getting a fair go, irrespective of what their postcode is, well, then we need a system of grants, which essentially transfers money from the richer communities to the poorer communities. Now, we do have a system of local government grants in Australia. It's called the Financial Assistance Grants. It often gets abbreviated, unfortunately, to the word FAGs. Now, there is always a campaign going on somewhere to increase the amount of money for the financial assistance grants. And there's currently a campaign run on this by ALGA. That would be good. It's always good to have more money in the bucket. However, the major problem with our intergovernmental grants scheme is that they're not allocated properly. Every state's beating to their own drum. None of them are actually doing it in an empirically defensible manner. Moreover, there's a couple little flaws with the legislation, which means that the rich councils always get a minimum payment. And you can't possibly have the poor councils catch up to the richer ones when everyone's getting a minimum payment. Now, in the legislation, it says that the purpose of the legislation is horizontal fiscal equalisation, which is defined as meaning that every local government area in the state is, through reasonable effort, if they tax the population appropriately, able to provide basic standards of services. Now, I've just gone through a road trip from Brisbane back down to where I live at Moonbi, is out Tamworth Way, and I drove through many rural areas. And they don't have basic levels of services. They don't have sealed roads. They don't have sewer services. They don't have rubbish collection. They don't have potable water. So clearly our grant system has failed to achieve the objective of the federal legislation. Now, for many years I've been trying to get the Commonwealth government interested in this. It's their money. They give it to the states to allocate. The states aren't allocating it properly. We need to get this fixed. It's really, really important for rural and regional and fringe communities, coastal communities in particular. It's important if we believe that Australia is a country of the fair go. It's important if we want our nation to develop, if we don't want vast tracts of empty land just not being used. It's as simple as that. We also need a fair tax regime. Most Australians don't realise that people out in the bush pay more tax. GST is a perfect example. It's 10% on the price of the good that you purchase. But the simple fact is that my loaf of bread that I buy out this way is much more expensive than a loaf of bread that you can buy in the capital city. My litre of milk that I buy out in the countryside is much more expensive than the litre of milk that you can buy in the capital city. Accordingly, because the GST is a fixed percentage on top of the price that the item is for sale at, it means that I am paying more GST for the same item than had I bought it in a capital city or a metropolitan area. It's as simple as that. Another way that rural communities pay more tax is via the fuel levies and the GST that's applied on top of the fuel excise tax. Obviously, when you live in a rural area, there is no public transport. There is no train or bus network or ferry. I have to drive everywhere, and you have to drive considerable distances to do my shopping, 30 odd kilometres. What that means is I'm using more fuel. What that means is I'm contributing more to the fuel excise tax collection and the GST that's based on that than other Australians. Now, we probably wouldn't mind paying more tax in rural areas if we were getting the same levels of services, but we don't. We don't get sealed roads. We get no Commonwealth services at all where I live, and very few state services either, even in the major regional centre that's associated with me. So taxes aren't fair. We are paying more taxes. Our burden per item is higher. It's just an undeniable fact. There's nothing fair about that. And to rub salt into the wound, we actually get ignored by the other states, by the states and federal government also. Greater decentralisation. If you want your nation to flourish, if you want it to be growing, not just in the three major capital cities, but in a sustainable way where you don't end up with huge congestion problems and you don't end up with huge risks, such as the contagion risk that bit us during COVID. If you want to develop this nation properly and fully and in an even way, then you need to decentralise government. Local government should be providing most of the services we use on a daily basis. State governments, realistically, they're in the Constitution, but they're completely irrelevant. They can't generate most of their income. They rely on the federal government. It would be much more sensible for the federal government to pass it directly to local governments. And the local governments who know the people best, who know what's required best, who know how to deliver the services best, should be delivering things such as education and health and police. Indeed, it's quite interesting that even state governments can't deliver them from their capital cities. They frequently and almost always split the state up into school districts and health districts and police districts. Well, why not just associate those districts with the local governments and let the local governments do the job properly? Cut out the state middleman, save a lot of money, have services provided fairly, have the people who are planning for the services actually bearing the consequences of their decisions. At the moment, somebody makes a decision in Sydney, or my health district's based in Newcastle, they're not seeing the actual outcome of their decision in Moombi because they never go to Moombi. No one goes to Moombi. If it was being done by my local government, which is at Tamworth, they would see the consequences of these decisions because they'd be living it all the time because they live in the area where the decision is being made. So these arguments and others are covered in my book, Saving Local Government. If we want to have even development, if we want to have a thriving economy throughout the country, not just in our capital cities, well then we need greater decentralisation. Infrastructure. If we want to see rural areas grow and survive and not die, we need proper infrastructure. We need the water network that John Howard talked about back in 2006 that still hasn't happened. We need to be linking our dams and pumping water between them. We need electricity networks that actually work. You know, and there's another grizzle from people like me in the country. I pay more for my electricity than what you do, but it's frequently out. And in fact, when there's load shedding, they always shed the country areas before they shed the capital cities. We pay extra, but we get the third world version of the service. Same with telecommunications and the internet. I pay $30 more than my colleagues per month than my colleagues in Sydney, and I get the third world wireless version, which is as slow as. I call it third world advisedly because the speeds in Egypt, in a third world nation, are much higher than what I receive. The train network, so we can freight stuff around and so people can move around. VFT, very fast train, was talked about back when I was a very young child. It still hasn't happened. It probably won't happen in my lifetime. Let's be realistic. But if it did happen, it would open up Australia. It would mean that you could live in a rural and regional area, work from home most of the time, but travel into the city when you needed to in a sensible time frame in order to be able to carry out face-to-face interactions. So if you invest in infrastructure, you get thriving communities. If you neglect those communities, don't give them reliable electricity, reliable telecommunications, reliable water, transport options, well, the communities die. It's as simple as that. Are we going to invest in our rural communities, or are we just going to give up on rural Australia? Invite some other country to purchase rural Australia from us and invest in the infrastructure and operate it in an efficient and in a manner that helps the rest of the world. Perhaps that's an option if we're not willing to develop Australia ourselves. Return royalties to the source. Except for Western Australia. Western Australia does do this, although not fully, but at least they do some of it. Mineral resources, one of our big exports. Yet the royalty money from that ends up in consolidated revenue and it ends up buying football stadiums in Sydney. That's really not fair, and it's not in the nation's interest. That money should be going into building reliable electricity, building reliable transport infrastructure in the areas where the mines are. That's only fair. We bear the cost of the mines. A lot of social problems come with mining, drug use, prostitution, crime. A lot of environmental problems come about because of mining. We bear all those costs out in the countryside, but the royalty money, the taxes associated with it, all end up in Sydney and the other capital cities. It's just plain inequitable, and it's bad economics. That money should be used to produce, to build productive infrastructure which will grow our national economy, not to build football stadiums in Sydney. And we need much more effective pest and disease management. I spent a lot of my time in Japan because I work for a university over there as well, some others abroad. And they're an island nation too, and they've managed to keep pests and diseases out of their nation. We seem to be inviting them in on a regular basis. I don't understand why. A lot of people don't realise this. Farmers pay an extra tax and fees that's supposed to be for weed and pest management. We struggle to see where the value for money of that is. I don't think people in cities understand that letting varroa mite in will devastate country areas. It'll just devastate our economy, but it devastates you personally when you go and see all your hives dead, which I'm anticipating will happen when varroa gets up here. Same with foot and mouth disease. We're not putting in anywhere near enough effort into that. It's not seen as a real problem by our leaders and decision makers who are sitting in capital cities, because they won't be the ones shooting their animals that they love and cared for and spent decades breeding up. They won't be the ones directly impacted in an economic sense. I don't think these things are being dealt with as well as they should be, and I think we can do an awful lot better. New Zealand on the whole does better. Japan does way better. As I say, we're an island nation. It shouldn't be that difficult. We could do a lot more with this foot and mouth disease, but it's hard to get people to care. So look, we can have strong rural and regional communities. We can. We simply need to tax fairly and return some of the money that we get from taxes for things that are produced in the countryside, to useful, productive infrastructure, which will grow the economy and make us all richer. You know, we're either one nation where everyone gets a fair go, or we're several nations. Maybe we're first world Australia and third world Australia, as a lot of people would say at the moment. We need to make a decision about whether we are indeed one nation, whether we do believe in a fair go, whether we want to grow our economy, and then we need to act accordingly. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.